All right, folks, so let's talk symbols and figures of speech in Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? Now, this story is just jam-packed with symbolism and illusion and allegory. There's no way I could cover it all in one video, or one video that was less than an hour long. But I want to hit some of the key elements to pay attention to and how we can use those to interpret the story. So the first of these major symbols in the story is music. Music had a heavy presence in the 1960s sort of youth counterculture. And I want to read to you just the representation of music in the first 2 pages. There are multiple mentions. So when we're describing Connie, it says everything about her had 2 sides to it, one for home and one for anywhere that was not home. Her walk, which could be childlike and bobbing, or languid enough to make anyone think she was hearing music in her head. And then later, when she's hanging out with her friends, it says they sat at the counter and crossed their legs at the ankles, their thin shoulders rigid with excitement, and listened to the music that made everything so good. The music was always in the background, the music like music at a church service. It was something to depend on. And then as she's continuing, and then she starts to sort of approach Eddie, she says, so they went out to his car, and on the way, Connie couldn't help but let her eyes wander over the windshield and faces all around her, her face gleaming with a joy that had nothing to do with Eddie or even this place. It might have been the music. And then when she's leaving with her father, she says, you couldn't hear music at this distance. So we know within the first 2 pages, a heavy mention of music, and the music is associated with this sort of revelry, this sort of youthful hanging out with her friends, hanging out with boys, this getting attention. We know that that's associated with music from the very beginning. Now, as the story goes on, though, you want to pay attention to the specific word choices and imagery that Oates uses to describe music. So, for example, all the boys fell back and dissolved into a single face that was not even a face, but an idea, a feeling mixed up with the urgent, insistent pounding of music. And then later on, Connie is described as bathed in a glow of slow pulsed joy. And then this music that's associated with this sort of like romanticized idea of youth and almost it seems like sexual attraction. That is precisely what Arnold Friend later uses to lure her out of her home. While she can listen to Arnold and her sort of talking through the door, it says that she's listening to the music from her radio and the boys blend together. And then later on, she says that everything about him and even about the music that was so familiar to her was only half real. So music in this story represents both this idea of like romance and sexuality and her coming of age and being attractive and hanging out with boys and all of that. But it also becomes a sense of danger and lures her into this darker place. The music becomes very sinister when Arnold is involved with it, which carries a symbolic meaning that we can apply in a lot of different ways, what that music represents in other facets of this story. Now, another symbol in this story to pay attention to is the car, Arnold's car. It's the gold jalopy. Now, cars, of course, represent this idea of independence and freedom, especially for teenagers, because cars are the independence to go where you want to go, when you want to go there. And so Connie is attracted to that. It's sort of how it's going to take her, off into this romanticized idea of what adulthood or what her coming of age is going to be. But Arnold's car is very interesting because it seems to be sort of a representation of Arnold himself. I mean, it has his name on it, and it's what he needs to lure her into to take her away. There are these numbers on the car, and the numbers in the car are 33, 19, 17, and Arnold says, now these numbers are a secret code, honey. Well, he's basically saying, hey, this is a symbol, reader. So what is that? What do those numbers symbolize? Well, the prevailing idea is that it's a reference to scripture. So Judges, which in the Old Testament, it's the 33rd book of the Bible if you count back from Revelation. And, a revelation is kind of like an epiphany, right? Which defines coming of age. Count 33 books back, and then verse 19:17 is, when he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, where are you going? Where did you come from? So this is almost certainly where we get the title, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? and of course creates sort of biblical illusion that we need to consider in the story. However, another literary scholar by the name of C. Harold Hurley has also said that those numbers carry sexual innuendo, because if you add them up, you get the number 69. And we know that Arnold's intentions with Connie are sexually deviant in nature, and so that's another interpretation of those numbers to consider. Now, there's also symbolism behind her house, and specifically the door. Now, doors represent a barrier, a threshold, and a transition from one place to the next. So remember, Connie says that there are two sides to her, one for home and everywhere that's not home. Now, everywhere that's not home is when she's like this more adult sort of somewhat vain, wants to hang out with boys, wants to sort of rebel and get into trouble and things. And then at home, she puts all of that away for her parents. So that suggests that her home is where she is this youthful, innocent, naive girl. And out in the world is when she's sort of testing the boundaries and sowing her wild oats. So youth and adulthood. And as she's standing at that door, she's standing at the threshold between her youth and her adulthood with Arnold. And eventually it's this green door. Arnold just says, like, that's nothing. I could come right in. Now, he doesn't cross it. He doesn't go in to her youth. He lures her out of it. So that's a symbolic sort of transition from one, part of her life to the next. Now, I want to talk about the characters and their dynamic and what that represents in terms of larger illusion and allegory and symbolism, all sorts of stuff. So with Connie, the descriptions that we get of Connie is that she's somewhat vain. She's staring at the mirror a lot, which is related to narcissists. We understand her to be somewhat naive, and she's very enamored with the idea of romance and hanging out with boys, and she's at that age where that's what she wants to do. Now, this does probably relate to some cultural context of the time where we're in the second wave of feminism, and women are becoming more empowered to, have sexuality at that point in time. So this could be speaking to that cultural fear. Regardless, Arnold Friend is an incredibly complex, symbolic piece of this story. So Arnold Friend is described in very specific ways. Shaggy black hair that looks crazy like a wig. There's a lot of talk about his boots. And he is definitely a symbol. Now, what symbol he is to be interpreted as, that's in the hands of the reader. But that symbolism goes back to some larger tropes to talk about. So the first of those is the trope of death and the maiden. So a trope is just something that it's like a style of story that appears throughout many different stories. And death and the maiden is basically when you have the personification of death that comes to a young maiden, often in like a manner of deception, and lures her to romantic ends. It is often loaded with erotic or sexual subtext. It is also often associated with imagery of light and dark, of youth and old age, and of life and death. Now, in the story, we get a lot of imagery about the sun and feeling the warmth of the sun on her, which goes back to that light and dark. We also get the moment when Connie lays eyes on Arnold. She drew her shoulders up and sucked in her breath with the pure pleasure of being alive. And just at that moment, she happened to glance at a face just a few feet from hers. It was a boy with shaggy black hair and a convertible jalopy painted gold. So the exact moment that she notices Arnold, she's talking about the joy of being alive. And we, of course, know that Arnold ultimately lures her to what is assumed to be her own sexual assault and murder. Now, this story was originally, Joyce Carol Oates has said that she originally wanted to title this story Death of the Maiden. So clearly this is the metaphor that she's working with. Now, there are other metaphors that you can interpret this story with, or other allusions you can interpret this story through, because remember, authorial intent doesn't matter. Now, one of the prevailing interpretations of Arnold Friend's character is that he is the embodiment of evil itself. Literally the devil in disguise. And you could interpret that literally or figuratively. So figuratively, he is just a representation of the devil or of Satan. But literally, there are interpretations of this story where Arnold is a supernatural entity in this story. There's a lot of talk about these boots. Him walking awkwardly on the boots. Him, acting like it describes it as drunkenly walking in these boots. It seems like his feet don't go all the way to the bottom. Lots of stuff going on with the boots, right? Well, lots of people interpret that to mean he doesn't have boots, or he doesn't have feet. He has hooves, or cloven feet, like the representation of the devil would. Now, he's also in support of that interpretation is the idea that his name, Arnold Friend, is a play on an old fiend, which again references Satan or the devil, the embodiment of evil. And he also, the way that as the story progresses, Arnold becomes increasingly more sinister and seems to be increasingly more disguised. She realizes that he's probably older than he looks. The thing with the boots, his physical descriptions, as well as all of that knowledge that he has about her. But I will remind you of that symbolic code on his car, which is a biblical allusion. I would also call back to the idea of Connie's vanity and how that might relate to her as a figure, of her as a sort of symbolic allusion to Eve being tempted by Satan, not to eat the apple necessarily, but certainly to sin. And that vanity, or that sort of pining for herself and her naivety, would be consistent with that as well. Now, the third interpretation that I will offer you, and these are not the only ones, comes from a literary scholar by the name of Joan Easterly, and that is a mythic interpretation. So, I've mentioned the boots and the potential for hooves. Now, we know that Charles Schmidt, the character that Arnold Friend was inspired by, would stuff his boots to appear taller in order to lure young girls. But the common interpretation is the devil. But another interpretation is that Arnold Friend is actually a mythic allusion to a satyr. Now, what is a satyr? If you've ever seen Disney's Hercules, Phil, that trains Hercules, as a satyr. They're represented in a number of different ways, either as half man, half goat, or half man, half horse. And they are known for being described as sort of rowdy, sort of boisterous, a little bit mischievous, often drunk, and highly sexual. Highly sexual. And there are, this is even back in like Greek art and things like that. It is very charged of that energy when satyrs are involved, specifically when they're involved with nymphs. Now, nymphs are another element of Greek mythology. They're a group of feminine water or nature spirits that are associated with different elements, water, etc., etc. And they are very much associated with satyrs in that sort of sexual context. There's an allusion to this in Disney's Hercules, as a matter of fact. But this is a really interesting way to interpret the story, because satyrs as these, drunken, highly sexual, mischievous, hooved beings, there are elements of the story that seem to support that. For example, when they're talking about Arnold and the boots, she describes him as like a clever drunken man. He managed to catch his balance, and that drunkenness goes back to the mythology of satyrs. And nymphs are often represented as being ethereally beautiful. And Connie and her being so pretty is a big part of her characterization. Now, when you interpret it through the myth or through the biblical allegory or through the allegory of the death and the maiden, All of these can carry different sort of larger meanings for the theme that you interpret inside the story. Now, this is not by far not all of the symbolic stuff going on in here. That gives you an idea of the different layers that you can uncover when you're looking at a story like this. And your best bet is to take some of these ideas and use them and let them ruminate a little bit and see what conclusions you can draw for your literary synthesis that you're preparing for, as well as your Socratic seminar coming up real soon.